During a recent appearance on The View, veteran reporter and former White House press secretary George Stephanopoulos made a pretty compelling case that it's absurd for the mainstream media to pretend that the upcoming election is a normal one between President Biden and Donald Trump, given that Trump is an anti-American authoritarian. But before we unpack all that, if you end up liking this video and you want to support the channel, please be sure to hit the like, subscribe, and alert bell before you go. I'd greatly appreciate it. All right, friends, we have a couple of clips to look at in this video, starting with this one here, the most recent appearance by George Stephanopoulos on The View. And again, I think he makes a pretty compelling case for the mainstream media's deficits here. So we're going to play this clip and another one, and we'll unpack it together.
Let's talk about the race, the 2024 race, because a lot of hand-wringing is going on. You know, you see headlines about how Trump is beating him in certain swing states.
He is,
and it's
right
quite
now.
disheartening. I mean, what more does the guy have to do to convince these people that he's inadequate at the very least? What is your point of view on
It is
this?
close right now. I think the polls do show that he's ahead probably in the states that matter
Yeah.
the most, largely because President Biden isn't doing as well as he did last time with younger voters and black voters.
Why? Because of what?
I think there's a lot of reasons for it, but really I think the most important thing that people should understand about this election is how far from normal it is. We have never had a former presidential candidate who was impeached and then indicted for trying to overturn an election. Never. In all of our history. We've never had a former president, a presidential candidate, who lies about the election that he lost. We've never had a former president or presidential candidate who refuses to pledge to accept the results of the next election if he lost. You know, the peaceful transfer of power is the most fundamental tenet of our democracy. Refusing to accept it, I think, is un-American. I believe it's unconstitutional. And I think it's the job of the media to put that into context.
Why isn't it getting through to people?
You know, I'm not sure exactly. I think part of the reason is the people you were talking about before in that courtroom, the allies of former President Trump who come in. It's the enablers in some way who say, instead of this being disqualifying, this is all acceptable. You know, this could have been stopped after January 6th. Trump was impeached. But the Senate said, we're not going to convict him because, he can be tried in a court of law. And now they turn around and say, well, it's illegitimate to try him in the court of law.
Yeah, so Stephanopoulos there made a couple of important observations, which I want to underscore here. So number one, that last one, when Donald Trump was impeached a second time for fomenting the January 6th insurrection, the Senate was still in control, or Republicans were still in control of the Senate, rather. And Mitch McConnell had an opportunity to have the impeachment trial in the Senate while Donald Trump was still president. For the next 2 or 3 weeks, he was going to be president of the United States. And he declined to do so, right? Probably because he knew that Trump would be convicted if that trial happened, and he wanted to have his cake and eat it too. So he said, no, we're going to kick the can down the road. Republicans lost control of the Senate. So shortly thereafter, Democrats assumed control. They had the trial of Donald Trump in the Senate, but Donald Trump was no longer in office. And so even though Senate Republicans, 7 Senate Republicans voted to convict Trump of impeachment, many others who said that Trump was responsible for January 6th, including Mitch McConnell, declined to vote for conviction because they said, listen, he's no longer president. If you want to go after him, you have to prosecute him through the Department of Justice. Now, of course, Trump's attorneys and other Republicans say you can't do that. You have to impeach him first. So again, just complete lack of principle and single standards. They just want to have their cake and eat it too. In large part because they probably assumed after January 6th that Trump would no longer be a viable political candidate. So they wouldn't have to convict him, that just the reputational damage alone of the January 6th insurrection would be enough to basically end the political threat that was Donald Trump. Obviously, that didn't happen because Republicans made the same mistake that a lot of main characters make in horror movies. They don't confirm that the monster has been truly defeated. And so he came back. Also good on George Stephanopoulos for pointing out the importance of the peaceful transfer of power. We talk about this a lot. That is a major institution that President Washington established. It's arguably the single most important political tradition that we have. Washington did it multiple times. He did it when he was the general of the Continental Army before the United States was effectively founded. It was after he defeated the British. He could have declared himself king. He could have defeated King George III and made himself King George I, and he chose not to. He gave power back. He did it again after the end of his second term, even though he could have ran for a third, fourth, fifth term or whatever until he died. And he chose not to do that. Then President Adams, after Washington, took that peaceful transfer of power and did something even, basically added to it because he lost election. He lost his re-election bid to Thomas Jefferson, a political rival. And Adams committed to the peaceful transfer of power. He took Washington's precedent and established it, this time going from one party to the next, okay? And so on and so forth until Donald Trump. And so, yeah, Donald Trump eminently disqualified himself. It's anti-American. It's unpatriotic. It's absolutely authoritarian. It's despicable. And here, George Stephanopoulos, this is from a monologue in a recent episode of This Week, which is the news show that he hosts. He calls out the media directly and challenges them not to treat this as though it were a conventional election.
The scale of the abnormality is so staggering that it can actually become numbing. It's all too easy to fall into reflexive habits, to treat this as a normal campaign, where both sides embrace the rule of law, where both sides are dedicated to a debate based on facts and the peaceful transfer of power. But that is not what's happening this election year. Those bedrock tenets of our democracy are being tested in a way we haven't seen since the Civil War. It's a test for the candidates, for those of us in the media, and for all of us as citizens.
100%. This is a test for everybody, not just on a partisan political basis, but also for the media as well. And before I read you some excerpts from articles that I think are important, I want to remind you that even outside the election proper, just when it comes to covering the records of President Biden and Donald Trump, you see an asymmetry. And we talked about this, the asymmetry of expectations. So this is the Associated Press. It's not Fox. It's the Associated Press, a relatively mainstream source, which is not well known for its bias. And yet when Donald Trump accomplishes something, it's celebrated. When Biden accomplishes something that's as good or better, it's kind of downplayed. So the Associated Press in 2018, U.S. employers added a robust $200,000 jobs in January. That's good. That's a good jobs report number for then President Trump. But when Joe Biden, 3 years later, while recovering from a pandemic mismanaged by Donald Trump, right? So if anything, you should be grading Biden on a curve because he's trying to clean up Trump's mess. They don't even do that. They grade him by an even harsher standard. U.S. employers added a sluggish 210,000 jobs in November. You see what they did there? They didn't grade Biden on a curve. They didn't even grade him on an equal curve, even though, again, he was recovering from a pandemic. Whereas in 2018, Donald Trump was riding the coattails of President Obama's very good economy. Instead, they graded Biden on a harsher curve. It's not the only situation. You look at, the recent jobs report in April. So Keith Edwards pointed this out. Same news, two different stories. The Guardian says the United States added 175,000 jobs in April in 40th straight month of gains as unemployment stays below 4.4% in largest such streak since 1953. It's pretty good. But the New York Times, of all people, they reported it this way. They said the U.S. employers added 175,000 jobs in April, a downshift in the pace of hiring. The unemployment rate ticked up to 3.9%. Right? So the New York Times is grading Biden harshly and putting a negative spin on it, as they are wont to do. Speaking of the New York Times, Joseph Kahn, their executive editor, was interviewed by Ben Smith of Semaphore about this sort of thing, about the role that the New York Times is supposed to play, or people expect them to play, in terms of covering this election fairly. So we're not going to read the whole thing, but I just want to read a couple of excerpts. Dan Pfeiffer, who used to work for Barack Obama, recently wrote of the Times, they don't see their job as saving democracy or stopping an authoritarian from taking power. This is the interviewer asking Joe Kahn, why don't you see your job as we've got to stop Trump? What about your job doesn't let you think that way? Joe Kahn, the executive editor of the New York Times, says, good media is the fourth estate. It's another pillar of democracy. One of the absolute necessities of democracy is having a free and fair and open election where people can compete for votes. And the role of the news media in that environment is not to skew your coverage towards one candidate or the other, but just to provide very good, hard-hitting, well-rounded coverage of both candidates and informing voters. If you believe in democracy, I don't see how we get past the essential role of quality media in informing people about their choice in a presidential election. To say the threats of democracy are so great that the media is going to abandon its central role as a source of impartial information to help people vote, that's essentially saying that the news media should become a propaganda arm for a single candidate because we prefer that candidate's agenda. So the problem here, and we'll get into a response to this interview, which, by the way, you should read in its entirety, is that I think people, and we talked about this, people in the media do this, debate moderators do this, enlightened centrists do this, to create a false equivalence. So if you have two people, in order to avoid the perception of bias, you will create an artificial balance if a natural one doesn't exist. So you take politics out of the equation, talk about climate change. Anthropogenic climate change is a fact. Or you know what? Forget climate change. Round Earth versus flat Earth. The Earth is round, period. The Earth is not flat. There are still a percentage of people in the United States and in the world who believe that the Earth is flat. Now, Joseph Kahn would probably say, well, if you're reporting on flat Earth and round Earth, you don't want to come off as biased. You've got to be fair. And I think he would think that means you've got to give flat Earth as much credibility as round Earth. You got to create an artificial balance because one naturally doesn't exist. That'd be stupid, right? You're not obligated to create a false equivalence. As a matter of fact, it's irresponsible, irrational, and dishonest to create a false equivalence, especially when two things are so wildly asymmetrical. It's the same thing here. And actually, John Harwood, another veteran reporter, recently wrote about this in Zateo, which is Mehdi Hassan's new enterprise. And by the way, you should follow and subscribe if you haven't. So Harwood says, Donald Trump is the first American presidential candidate to explicitly threaten the democratic system on which a free press depends. He could win. Considering the stakes for the country, that ought to be the campaign issue that dwarfs all others. Times executive editor Joe Kahn doesn't think so. Citing opinion polls, he told Semaphore recently that voters care less about preserving democracy than immigration, inflation, and the economy. Rather than becoming, quote, a propaganda arm of the Biden campaign, Kahn shapes coverage by voters' concerns. His arguments presents a couple of problems. First, allocating journalistic resources by polling cedes the judgment of editors to political actors who work overtime to shape public opinion. That's particularly problematic as authoritarian foreign powers such as Russia, amplified by some members of the Republican Party, relentlessly inject propaganda into our debates. Also, if we're just deferring, listen, we're just going to cover what people care about. I mean, let's be clear, what people care about is important, right? Because you're trying to get eyes on your paper. But if that's the only concern, or even the ultimate concern, then why are you covering politics at all? More people are interested in keeping up with the Kardashians and the Real Housewives of Atlanta and Love is Blind and Love Island and trash reality TV. So perhaps you should just scrap your entire politics division and dedicate more people to the latest TikTok trend. Joe Kahn would be like, oh, no. Well, we don't take it that far. And I'd be like, duh, Joe, of course, which is why perhaps what people care about in the immediacy should be a factor in your coverage, but it should not be the sole or even necessarily the determining factor. You have to exercise editorial discretion, not merely follow what people want to hear. Otherwise, you wouldn't be talking about politics at all. So it is a stupid argument from Joe Kahn. Second, the imperative not to aid the pro-democracy side becomes a little precious when the alternative poses a clear and present danger to the constitutional order. Journalists are not indifferent to the survival of the American system. Certainly not, especially when Trump has repeatedly publicly vowed that if he becomes president, he's going to wield the powers of the state, the awesome powers of the presidency, which, by the way, he will attempt to expand via Project 2025, and he'll wield those powers against the media that he perceives to be critical of him. So if the New York Times publishes a critical piece about Donald Trump, they may soon face the awesome powers of the presidency. And then what? Right? Not only does the New York Times and the mainstream media have a civic obligation to call Donald Trump out for the anti-American authoritarian that he is, they actually have a lot of self-interest. They have a lot of skin in the game, so to speak. Neutrality between political actors has been a cardinal journalistic principle since 20th century news organizations adopted a professional ethic of objectivity. The power of that principle explains why so many journalistic accounts frame Biden and Trump in parallel as two sides of the conventional political coin. So instead of analyzing the two men's demonstrated capacities to handle the presidency, for example, stories observe that Trump holds an edge because voters consider Biden too old. Instead of qualitative assessments of their economic policies, stories revolve around Americans' stated unhappiness with the incumbent's record. But the poll-driven balance represents a dubious safe harbor when the central issue is preserving or abandoning free and fair elections, popular sovereignty, and rule of law. Consequences that momentous demand sustained, sober exploration. And then it goes on to make the case against Trump. I just want to read this last part here. Covering the menace Trump poses in the proportion it deserves might not influence voters' choices in any case, but it has its own value in affirming another cardinal principle. The journalists center our coverage on what is important and true. Well said, John Harwood, again in that article from Zateo, which you should read in its entirety. Folks, I think George Stephanopoulos is right. I think that you don't want, but President Biden has said that he doesn't want, and I believe him, and I believe this is a good principle in general. I'm not asking the media to weigh in on whether a progressive marginal tax rate or conservative marginal tax rate is just better policy or whatever. I'm not asking you to make a value judgment on specific policy items, but given that our institutions require good faith from the powerful actors who shape them, and Donald Trump would become the most powerful person in the world again if he wins the election, it's probably important to be fair and to not create false equivalence and to not just merely follow the fickle passions and prejudices of the American people. Because again, if that's the case, if all we're going to talk about is just what Americans care about and that's it, the New York Times should just pack its bags, shut down its politics division, and dedicate all of those reporters to covering Taylor Swift. That would probably be a better use of their time. They would again say, no, that's ridiculous. And I would challenge them why. And they would say, because what people want can't be the only concern. Precisely. So even if preserving democracy is not the most important polling issue for Americans, you could easily make the case that in just terms of being the foundation by which all other concerns, the economy, immigration, inflation, all these things are addressed, that the New York Times and the mainstream media has an obligation to cover it fairly. And if you're going to cover it fairly, you don't give Trump a boost to compensate so you don't come off partisan. President Biden is just objectively more pro-democratic than Donald Trump in a meaningful way. And to pretend otherwise is to lie. And I do feel that in many ways that is what the mainstream media is doing. So good on George Stephanopoulos for calling the media out, and good on John Harwood for writing this op-ed, which really lays out the stakes. Let me know what you think in the comments.